This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 172 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest this week is Tim Tate. Tim has worked as a documentary filmmaker and an investigative journalist for more than 40 years, and in that time has published 19 books and produced 80 documentaries. Some of the topics he's covered in the past include China's slave labor gulags, the worst child murderer in British history, and the orphans left behind after the Vietnam War, among many others. Tim was also my guest for episode number 30 of the podcast when we discussed his book Agent Sniper about Michael Goleniewski, a Polish intelligence officer who became one of the CIA's best agents in place behind the Iron Curtain. I invited Tim back onto the podcast to discuss his newest book, To Catch a Spy: How the Spycatcher Affair Brought MI5 in from the Cold. It's the story of Peter Wright, MI5's senior counterintelligence officer who came to suspect in the 1960s that the agency's director, Roger Hollis, was himself a Soviet spy. By the way, if you're looking for a way to get friends and family as interested in history as you are, or if you want to learn something new and unexpected every month, then make sure to check out History by Mail. Every month, History by Mail will send you reproductions of famous and influential historical documents from American history. Accompanying the documents themselves are articles which put them in the context of their times and help you understand the impact they had on the course of American life. The topics are widely varied, so you're always learning something new across themes that include historic inventions, American wars, and foreign diplomatic relations. I'm really enjoying my own subscription because it's opened my eyes to historic events I knew nothing about. You can subscribe for yourself or gift a subscription at historybymail.com for as little as $6.50 a month. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code Justin10 for a permanent 10% off your subscription. Tim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. You're always welcome, I promise. Peter Wright and Roger Hollis have come up briefly in a few previous episodes, but I'm really glad for the chance to hear about this amazing story from you finally.
Well, again, thank you for having me. It is an extraordinary story.
Truly is. And I'm very glad that there's a new book about it to help me catch up on it, because I do have Spycatcher on my shelf. And to hear not just the story of Spycatcher, but then the aftermath of publication as well is a really key component of the story. So everybody's going to learn about it now from you.
Well, I will do my best.
Thank you. So can you tell me why you decided to make this the subject of your 19th book?
Sure. Well, Peter Wright and Spycatcher came up during my research for the book that you mentioned on Mikhail Goleniewski. Wright was one of the MI5 officers briefed by Goleniewski on Soviet penetration of British intelligence, and Goleniewski had provided Wright with a lead to identify a mole operating at a very senior level inside MI5. Now, when the Spycatcher affair happened, I was a youngish journalist. And like millions of other people around the world, I was astonished by the British government's attempts to silence Peter Wright. So, it's probably worth, for those who don't remember the story, just recapping what it was. And it is that between 1985 and 1991, the British government fought a succession of vastly expensive, hugely damaging, and ultimately unsuccessful battles in courts across the world to prevent Peter Wright, a retired MI5 officer, from publishing his memoirs. And those memoirs, his book, Spycatcher, was a very personal account of his own obsessive and relentless hunt for suspected Russian moles inside the British establishment, politics, the civil service, academia, trades unions, and above all, within the security service itself. But in its attempts to silence the troublesome old spy, Downing Street, the government here, twisted itself into truly fantastical legal and political knots, and in doing so attracted global ridicule and denunciation. So when I finished the Goleniewski book, I wanted to go back and examine what had actually happened during the Spycatcher affair, and to see whether there was an unpublished information which I could locate, which would cast it, if you like, in a new light. And very quickly it became clear that there was a plethora of this. There was an entire secret history of the Spycatcher Affair to be revealed, and that's what my book does.
Yeah, it certainly does, and it was a very, very fascinating read for me because I saw some things, as I mentioned in the book, people and events that I was somewhat familiar with, but it really cast them in a new light for me as well. Also, I do not believe that we've spent much time at all here on the podcast so far covering MI5 as an organization. So, if you don't mind, because MI6 has come up so many times in the past, can you kind of talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between MI5 and the American FBI, for example?
Absolutely. This isn't an exact parallel, but essentially, MI5 is the British equivalent of the FBI. MI5's specific remit. MI5 is also known as the Security Service, and its specific remit, which is slightly different from the FBI's, is the defense of the realm. That's a quote. So MI5 is primarily a domestic intelligence agency. It does not, unlike the FBI, have any wider law enforcement role or investigation remit into non-security related
Hmm.
crimes. And its counterpart, as you say, is MI6, which is Britain's foreign intelligence service.
Okay, so is MI5 essentially is it oversimplification to say it's entirely a counterintelligence, counterespionage organization?
It's not an oversimplification. That's pretty much what its remit is. The devil is always in the detail, and
Hmm.
that depends on how you define counterintelligence and counterespionage. And throughout its history, particularly in the period that we're talking about, MI5 officers and MI5's management took a peculiarly elastic view of what its remit amounted to.
Yes, I agree. I was just thinking to myself that it can be kind of a slippery slope. Counterintelligence work can be, and then you bring up elastic is honestly a perfect analogy, perfect metaphor, I think, really for that. And it seems like Peter Wright, he certainly pushed the boundaries in so many ways throughout his career and throughout his kind of almost single-minded pursuit of this Soviet penetration, as I'm sure we're going to get into. So he was a very curious character to me. I had a little bit of a difficulty getting a bead on him. Honestly, I felt like he's incredibly driven and incredibly disciplined guy in so many ways, but I didn't really get like a three-dimensional sense of who he was. So can you just talk about him, like his early life growing up and what kind of shaped him as a counter espionage professional in later years?
Absolutely. Before we do, if I might, it's worth pointing out that at the time of the Spycatcher affair and before, MI5 didn't officially exist. It had been at
Hmm.
work for decades, but it had never been put on the statute books. There was never a law which said MI5 exists, we have this domestic intelligence agency. And that meant that its officers were largely free to ignore the law. I mean, as Wright himself put it, we bugged and burgled our way across London at the state's behest, while pompous bowler hatted civil servants looked the other way. The
Oh
law
wow.
was by and large irrelevant to MI5. It did what it damn well liked.
My God.
And I have to say that appealed to Peter Wright. There's no question about that. So, who was he? The question you originally asked. Peter Wright was actually a second generation boffin. Boffin, it's a curiously English word, but it kind of generally means someone with a scientific bent who may not have formal scientific training. And that was certainly Peter Wright.
Hmm.
His father, Morris Wright, was a talented scientist who was employed by Marconi Company, on wireless technology, but who, during the First World War, World War One, worked for MI6. His son, Peter Wright, was born in 1916 in the middle of a Zeppelin raid on England, and he was premature. And he grew up as a small child with rickets and what became a lifelong stammer. Growing up, Morris Wright told his son Peter stories of Morris's espionage daring do, I suppose you could call it, and inculcated him in the mysteries, as they were then, of wireless technology. And in doing so, he fueled Peter Wright's interest in both spying and science. And Wright was a clever boy. As he entered his middle teenage years, he was clearly academic and he was due to win a scholarship to Oxbridge. But tragedy intervened. Morris Wright was made redundant from Marconi. He fell down into alcoholism. The family finances collapsed, and at the age of 15, Peter was removed from his school and abruptly told to go find a job. And for 3 years, he did just that. He worked as a farm hand, a labourer on farms in Cornwall and Scotland. But in doing so, he scraped together just enough money to fund for himself a place studying rural economy at the School of Rural Economy in Oxford. And that would have been fine, but then the Second World War intervened. That school closed down before Peter could take up his place. Morris had by then got his drinking under control and joined the Royal Naval Scientific Service, and Peter joined him there, working on a temporary basis on something called degaussing. This was the need to disguise British ships' magnetic fields to protect them against German mines. There was no manual for this. There was no established technique. So Peter Wright and his colleagues invented one. They invented a workaround solution. And it worked. During the Second World War, they degaussed everything from battleships to submarines, and with some success. After the war, he took his civil service exams, passed with flying colours, and joined the Royal Naval Scientific Service full time. And that was the start of his career in government service. And from the outset, it was always science.
I see. That was one of the things that really kind of surprised me about him, because he had this technical skill, this technical capability that he brought with him to MI5 clearly. And I was kind of surprised at how he moved into sort of like a leadership and investigative role from there. I know that he had a major part to play in the discovery of the so-called Thing bug at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in, I believe it was 1956? Was it
Oh,
when that was
no,
discovered?
earlier.
Earlier, okay. Yeah, can you tell me about that a little bit?
Sure. Wright was working for RNSS, the Royal Naval Scientific Service. And at the time, British intelligence, particularly MI5, was kind of in the doldrums. It had had a very good war, but it had then reverted to a sort of earlier torpor, and it didn't really have any scientific resources. So MI5 brought in Wright as an ad hoc, part-time, voluntary, if you like, scientific advisor, which is where the Thing comes in. In the early 50s, the British air attaché in Moscow was monitoring a Soviet Air Force radio channel when he overheard conversations between American diplomatic personnel inside the American embassy in Moscow, mysteriously coming through the ether. So US State Department investigators swept the entire building, and eventually they located the telltale signal, which was coming from the ambassador's office. And a further search revealed the presence of an entirely new type of microphone, which had been hidden inside the Great Seal of the United States, which is a substantial wooden carving of the national emblem, which had been gifted to the US Embassy by the Kremlin in 1945 and had then been mounted proudly on the ambassador's wall. The Thing as the FBI termed the device, was taken down and removed and flown back to Washington, D.C. And for several months, US scientists, American scientists, probed and prodded at it, trying to work out, without success, how the hell it worked. They couldn't. And finally, they conceded defeat, and the seal and the microphone were shipped to Britain, where they were handed to Peter Wright for analysis. And for 3 months, using homemade detection equipment, he experimented, just as his father, Morris, had shown him, with a wide variety of frequencies. And early in 1952, after winding his dials up and down the wireless spectrum, because it was that crude in those days, Wright found the magic number of megahertz. The microphone suddenly illuminated on its own and emitted a clearly detectable signal. MI5 inevitably was delighted. Using the thing as a prototype, British intelligence would now be able to develop its own radio-controlled microphones, and Wright was tasked with producing a prototype of this.
Yeah, what an incredible guy he is, especially using homemade equipment to figure out something that had frustrated the entire US government up to that point. So tremendous capabilities there, and it kind of ushered in a new era of audio equipment, audio technology as well, and he was right there at the forefront.
It was absolutely revolutionary. I mean, if you think before that, and was of particular importance in the growing Cold War, where electronic espionage was going to be key. Before that, before that discovery, covert microphones had to be physically switched on in place. Now, that's obviously a bit of a problem if you're trying to do this in target premises owned or occupied by Soviet bloc intelligence. What Wright was able to discover with the thing, by essentially unpicking what the Soviets had already done, was to work out how you could turn on a microphone remotely using radio waves. Lest we forget, Wright did this, as you say, when the secrets of the thing had eluded highly trained scientists in the US. Wright did this without any formal scientific training. He had none. He had no college degrees or formal qualifications in science. And that, plus what his father had rammed home in their lessons out of school, was a lesson that Wright took to heart. From then on, he distrusted what he saw as establishment scientists or establishment figures. He, in his memorable phrase, he described them as velvet-arsed bastards who were very rarely right. And, that would be a signature attitude throughout his career.
Wow. Very impressive guy, certainly. And he's right there at the dawn of a new era, like we talked about. I'm curious, though, how does someone with that technical capability, he seems like a tremendous asset to MI5, but how does he go from there to like a leadership role over the larger investigative picture, which, I assume takes an entirely different sort of skill set and people handling and that sort of thing? Was it just something that he also showed a lot of aptitude for as well, or did it require a lot of training for him over the years?
The absolute opposite, the very reverse. Wright fell into it in a way we'll discuss, I guess, in a moment. But, I've talked to a number of people who knew him and worked with him, and everyone had the same view. Counterintelligence, counterespionage was the very last thing that Peter Wright was trained or probably psychologically equipped for. He joined MI5 in 1955 as its first ever scientific officer. You think about that, MI5 until the mid-50s didn't have an in-house scientist. And even before then, he developed a range of very innovative surveillance technology for the security service. So joining the service full-time fulfilled the service's very evident need, and it was also Wright's dream. It was, he was combining spying with science, the two things he had grown up admiring. And he set about from the beginning improving MI5's antediluvian surveillance technology. And he described finding what he called a thick layer of wartime dust over everything inside MI5, and was appalled to discover just how primitive MI5's technical capabilities were. As its scientific officer, he set about upgrading that, particularly the microphones and surveillance technology, the covert surveillance technology. But the more he did that, the more he upgraded the microphones and bugs, the more he uncovered a rather more serious problem. Because almost every operation that MI5 had mounted against Soviet bloc intelligence failed. Even those which appeared at first to have succeeded were subsequently revealed to have been false dawns, as Wright himself later testified in secret session, very secret session during the main Spycatcher trial in Australia. This is what he said. All the operations against the Russians, whether they were double agent or technical operations, failed. The fact is that from 1951 to 1958, MI5 had no success against the Russians. And the only explanation for this, as the service itself eventually and grudgingly accepted, was that somewhere inside MI5's headquarters, Leconfield House, there lurked a Russian spy or spies. And in 1962, in 1962, Wright was tasked officially by MI5 with digging through the service's historic files to try and unearth the traitor. And that date and that point was the start of his lifelong and obsessive hunt for moles.
That is incredible to think that for a 7-year period, this organization did not have any major successes, like you mentioned, because 51 through 58, what an incredibly transformative time for the world and for the international security situation. Of course, everything that happened in Eastern Europe, especially encroaching Soviet satellite states and that sort of thing. And to think that MI5 was not having any successes. I mean, there must have been quite a few people, I have to imagine, that were very concerned about this as well. But did it essentially like only fall to Peter to try to figure this out? Were they kind of having to face the unthinkable, that they had a very, very senior placed mole, Soviets did, inside of MI5?
Wright wasn't the only one to come to that conclusion, but it would take both him and the team he set up and was officially tasked with setting up several years, many years of investigation to work out who, what, where, why, when, and how. And although he only began work on doing this in 1962, the first clues dated back to the end of the Second World War. I mean, these were historic files that he was examining on Soviet defectors, both successful and those who were caught, going back to the mid and late 1940s, and a succession of cases, incidents, files thereafter, all the way up through the mid-50s. And at which point, I think it brings us neatly to Kim Philby. Your listeners, I know, will know all about Kim Philby, MI5's probably most senior officer for a good 20-year period, who had been privy to all MI6's secrets, but whom MI5 suspected of being a Soviet spy, a very senior Soviet spy. In 1955, Philby was brought in to MI5 headquarters for a formal interrogation. Unfortunately, MI5 didn't get to carry out that interview. Philby's own employer, MI6, handled it, and it proved to be very protective of him. The interrogation took place inside Leconfield House, MI5's HQ. Peter Wright was tasked with wiring the interview room with sound, and he listened in on headphones as the interrogations progressed. And he was appalled to hear the MI6 interrogator actively helping Philby, guiding him to answers which would deflect suspicion.
Oh my gosh.
And afterwards, and despite MI5's clear and correct belief that Philby was a Soviet spy, MI6 cleared him, at least for the time being. But for Wright, as he leafed through, worked through, pored over these old files, Philby's name kept cropping up in them, and in ways which indicated that all was very far from well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We have done a previous episode, and of course, Philby's come up again and again, and so have the other members of the Cambridge Five. I'm curious, aside from this involvement with the interrogation, did Wright have any other involvement in that investigation? I know that Philby eventually made it to Russia. Was that also in 1962? I think he made it to Russia and stayed there afterwards.
No, it was a year later than that.
Ah, okay.
Having been cleared, not just by MI6, but I should say on the floor of the House of Commons by the then Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, said, no, this man is not a Soviet spy. Well, he was.
Mm-hmm. Was this an instance of MI6 wanting to avoid embarrassment, or did they genuinely not believe that he was a Soviet spy, or something else, you think? I mean, just a horrible, horrible fumble with tremendous implications and consequences for many years to come, of course.
That would be a question for MI6, which is not what you could call transparent here. What I would say is that its actions in that first interrogation, in helping Philby deflect suspicion, and then when it finally got round to interrogating him again and securing what it thought was the gold standard confession in 1963, were at best hapless. At worst, if you wanted to put that spin on it, they were deeply, deeply suspicious.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see. So, as you mentioned, this mole hunt drove Peter Wright for many, many years, long after Philby had actually defected, of course. So, what were some of the clues then after the defection that Philby had not been potentially the only mole inside, or the only mole that they needed to be worried about?
As Wright pored over these old files, Philby's name kept cropping up. You wouldn't be surprised by that, but often as not, it would crop up in conjunction with or in connection with a man called Sir Roger Hollis, who was the MI5 Director General, the head of MI5, Britain's most senior domestic spy. Hollis was a long-serving MI5 officer. He joined the service in 1938. He rose through the ranks and became Director General in 1956, and he remained as Director General until his retirement in 1965. By that time, by 1965, Wright's investigations into Soviet penetration had clearly shown there was a mole inside MI5. And the evidence, some of it stemming from the Philby case, showed that there were only two possible candidates. One was the Deputy Director General, Graham Mitchell, and the other was Hollis, the DG himself.
Do you believe that Wright was convinced one way or the other as to those two suspects, or did he maintain sort of an open mind and an open investigation in case there were others as well?
We have to remember that this investigation took place over at least an 8-year period.
Hmm.
By the time Hollis retired in 1965, Wright and a number of other senior MI5 officers were absolutely convinced that either he or Mitchell, his deputy, was the mole. A formal investigative committee, which was codenamed FLUENCY and which was led by Wright, was set up to examine all the evidence. And from 1965 onwards, for 8 years, it produced at least 3 reports, and a follow up inquiry added a fourth. All of those said that on the balance of probability, Hollis was a Soviet spy.
Hmm. So, Tim, were there any of the other pretty standard indicators aside from this, what you've mentioned already? Did Roger Hollis have any, unexplained income or, communist leanings in his youth or anything like that cropped up during this investigation that might further kind of reinforce it? Or was it really just looking at operations during his tenure as Director General?
It was almost exclusively the latter. Hollis, if you looked at his life and career, his early life and career, had led a rather dull life. I mean, he had not been involved in the intellectual circles which led to the Cambridge spy rings. He was a rather quiet, dull man. Yes, he had travelled extensively in the 20s and 30s, including in China and Russia. But if you looked at his life, looking through the lens, trying to find something which would indicate that doesn't look quite right, then I think you'd struggle. And they did struggle. What they found instead, Wright and his FLUENCY team, were 28 solid pieces of evidence. These were known as serials or true bills in MI5 jargon, which were unearthed from MI5's historic files on Soviet intelligence defectors from the end of World War II to the late 1950s. Just to be absolutely clear, none of these 28 pieces of evidence were absolute proof positive. But coupled with top secret decryptions of wartime Russian cyber traffic, which was codenamed Venona, and again on which Wright was tasked to work, all of these pointed strongly at Hollis as a Soviet spy.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, I see. That's, yeah, some very damning evidence on the one hand, certainly, and some many unanswered questions on the other as well. So, prior to Hollis's retirement, did Wright or did anyone confront him? What was he subjected to an interview or an interrogation himself as the head of MI5?
Wright certainly confronted him, but not at Wright's own choosing. Just before Hollis retired, he summoned Wright to the Director General's office inside Leconfield House and said, I asked him, why am I under suspicion? Because he knew he was under suspicion. And for an hour, Wright painfully laid out the key evidence, all those 28 serials or true bills, which pointed to the existence of a highly placed mole inside MI5 with Hollis as the prime suspect. Now, this is treachery, this is treason on a major scale. And I think if you or I were confronted with that, we would be a little worried, wouldn't we?
Certainly.
Hollis's reaction was unexpectedly sanguine. He simply joked to Wright. He said, "Oh, you've got the manacles on me, haven't you?" Before insisting quietly, "All I can say is that I am not a spy." Well, Wright and the FLUENCY Committee and large swathes of MI5 chose to differ. They were of the opinion, and I think there is a great deal of evidence to support this, that it was more likely than not that Hollis was exactly what they suspected, a long-term undercover Soviet mole.
Wow. That's really an incredible conclusion to reach about the Director General of MI5. That's really astonishing.
Well,
Did this
it's unprecedented,
right?
and it's this is the most senior domestic intelligence officer in the country. There is nothing, but nothing, of Britain's most sensitive intelligence secrets that hadn't passed across his desk.
Mm-hmm.
If he was, as Wright and FLUENCY and the others believed, a Soviet spy, that meant everything potentially had been blown.
Yeah, just incredible to think about. And I know it's so far in the past right now, but it really is just mind-blowing that something like that could happen, that it's even conceivable. And it's also, I have to say, it's really unfortunate, just from the way you're describing that actual meeting, that the dynamic in my mind was very much in Roger's favor, because if he's calling a subordinate to his office, that's kind of a terrible way to start a subject interview, or to elicit a confession from somebody, because the power dynamics of that situation are in Roger's favor, and he's got his subordinate who's kind of being compelled to lay out all of the evidence in front of him. I could just see how that didn't work out in Peter's favor, but also that there wasn't really any other way that it could have played out at that time. So for the time being, up through Roger's retirement, did all of this stay completely within MI5, or did the investigation eventually leak out prior to publication of the book?
It stayed not just within MI5 for many years. It was MI5 specifically concealed this from the British government. Downing Street, the prime ministers were not told for several years, when eventually, many years afterwards, the then Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, was told about this. I know this because I got the document with his handwriting on it. Wilson scrawled on the top of this briefing note, "This is very disturbing, even if not proven." And I think he was right.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Before we go on, I want to tell you all about a new podcast from Tenderfoot TV called To Die For. Imagine you were a fly on the wall at a dinner between the Mafia, the CIA, and the KGB. That's where this unprecedented podcast begins. Brought to you by the makers of the hit podcast To Live and Die in LA, To Die For marks the first time a Russian-trained honey trap has told her story from beginning to end. Taught to seduce men for their secrets, and sometimes their lives, Alia Rosa was trained to believe that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. She was meticulously trained to be the perfect weapon, able to seduce her targets into compromising situations that have ended careers, and sometimes lives. From Tenderfoot TV, the studio that brought you Up and Vanished, and To Live and Die in LA. Make sure you check out To Die For, available beginning on March 26th, wherever you get your podcasts. Did Hollis at the time, did he have supporters among the rank and file of MI5? Were there people that, when they learned about this, they thought that Peter Wright was a crank, that he was chasing shadows or something? Or was it kind of a widely held belief that Hollis could actually be a Soviet spy at the time?
Yeah, MI5 was not, probably still not, still isn't, a monolithic organization. Certainly at the time, in the late 50s and through the mid to late 60s and onwards, there was a deep divide within MI5 itself. Part of that divide was the traditional English bugbear, the bane of English life, which is class. Wright and several of his colleagues were viewed by the top brass, the top management, as, in their parlance, NCOs, non-commissioned officers. The senior management were all officer class, and they viewed Wright and his ilk as several ranks down the social scale, and that didn't help. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that Wright's somewhat prickly nature, remember the velvet-arsed bastards comment, wouldn't have helped either. He did rub people up the wrong way. And the developed within MI5 almost two sides pointing their arguments at each other. And Hollis and the investigations into Hollis were the touchstone for this. So there was Wright and his colleagues who said, this is serious, the evidence is persuasive, to put it mildly. And there were those on the other side who viewed Wright and his colleagues as witch hunters. And I mean, that was pretty much the phrase that was used.
Mm-hmm.
So it caused a substantial rift within MI5 itself.
I can certainly believe that. So, as I understand it, Hollis retired from his position with his reputation untarnished by this because it stayed within MI5 entirely. So, what happened to him afterwards? Did he just live out his days kind of quietly after that, or did anything come out later on?
He retired on a full and generous pension to a verdant village in the English countryside and lived a very happy retirement for several years. Finally, however, in 1973 or thereabouts, he was summoned back to MI5 for a formal interrogation. Now, frankly, that interrogation should have taken place many years earlier. It didn't, for various reasons: incompetence, ineptness, hesitancy within MI5, and it's particularly its senior management. But shortly, a little before he died, Hollis was summoned back for a formal interrogation. The problem is that by that point, there was very little in the way of leverage that Wright or his mole-hunting colleagues in MI5 had over Hollis. Hollis was gone. Hollis was retired. They didn't. MI5, because it didn't exist, doesn't have the power of arrest. It doesn't have that form of law enforcement or police type powers. Yes, they could insist that Hollis came back in for interrogation, but unless he came clean and confessed, there was very little likelihood that they were going to get to the point of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And, in fairness, Hollis knew all the evidence against him. Why did he know? Because he'd been party to it when he was inside MI5 as its Director General. And so, with a little bit of exception, the long suppressed but reports, which I eventually got hold of, surrounding this, say that there was some reason to doubt that he was entirely honest or frank about his early years and early travels pre his time with MI5. Beyond that, they weren't able to lay a glove on him, and he left MI5's headquarters, got on the train, and went home to his pleasant cottage in the pleasant Sussex countryside. And he died thereafter, his reputation completely intact, because all of this was still being kept secret.
Mm-hmm. That really is amazing. And of all the stories that I've covered, it's very rare. And this is going on the assumption that Hollis was a Soviet spy. Of course, if he wasn't, then it's fine. But if he was a Soviet spy, he won the game essentially in a way that almost no one ever does. At least according to all the books I've read and all the interviews I've had the past few years. But very, very few people retire quietly to the countryside with their reputation intact, their pension intact, and never see the inside of a jail cell ever. But Hollis did. Amazing.
Yeah, Hollis, but I mean, we've got to remember that he pretty much held all the cards. He knew all
Hmm.
the evidence against him.
Hmm.
He knew how MI5 interrogations worked. He was holding pretty much all of the cards. And you just, again, so we're clear, the Hollis saga tends to elicit fairly strong arguments on both sides of the coin, both those who say, yeah, he was a spy, and those who say, oh, no, he wasn't. It's ridiculous. It's Peter Wright and his mole hunting. Part of the reason that remains unresolved is that the evidence, the files on Hollis and on Wright's mole hunting relating to Hollis, have been suppressed. They've been kept secret. And they remain secret. Despite my best attempts to prize them from the British government, they remain secret. However, I managed to prize eventually, after nearly 4 years of arguing, some files, and these were the Prime Minister's files on the Spycatcher Affair, out of Downing Street. They were released belatedly and after my book had been completed on New Year's Eve last year. So December the 31st, 2023. 47 years after they were created.
Hmm.
And I fortunately got hold of them and in time to include their contents within the book. Hidden within them, buried within them, are fragments of what the last formal report into Hollis's guilt or innocence said. And so we're clear again, the Prime Minister in 1979, 1980, 1981, Margaret Thatcher, had stood up in the House of Commons when the scandal became public, and she'd said unequivocally Roger Hollis wasn't a spy and that this final investigation had cleared him. Well, the files I found, the fragments of those files I found, told a rather different story. What they said, in word for word this is that final inquiry conducted by a very senior British government official, not someone from MI5, concluded that there was a 20% possibility that Hollis had been a Soviet spy. That's a very far cry from exonerating the man completely, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's incredible. So this is something that's just coming out with your book. Is that right? It's seeing the light of the day for the first time now?
Absolutely right. As I say, those files were suppressed. And despite my best efforts for 3.5 years, the government refused to release them. Eventually, it did so. It snuck them out. If I'm a cynical man, I think it snuck them out knowing that, or believing that my book had gone to press. Happily, it hadn't, and I was able to include this.
Incredible. Yeah, that 20% figure, that really, it just leaves the door wide open, I think. The fragments that you were able to see, does it articulate why the number 20% as opposed to 10% or 30%, for example?
No, but it said that this very senior civil servant who conducted the inquiry, and he took a year to do it and talked to most of the members of the FLUENCY committee who had investigated Hollis and come to their own conclusion that Hollis was a spy. This official, Lord Berk-Trend, specifically put the percentage figure on it. He said 80 to 20%. 80% that he wasn't a spy, 20% that he was a Soviet spy. It was him who put that percentage figure on it. Yes, he did it in secret, and yes, it was kept secret ever since until I got hold of it. But, I look at this and I think if there's a 20% chance that Britain's most senior domestic intelligence officer was a Soviet spy, then that's something that the British public, the British taxpayers, let alone the intelligence services with whom we have relationships in the US and elsewhere, they have a right to know that.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree, because that really just changes the perspective on so much of what happened for such a large period of time during the lifetimes of most of the British citizens who would know that name, certainly.
Absolutely. And, ultimately, although MI5 and the British government mounted a fairly successful smear campaign against Peter Wright and tried to portray him as this dotty old, obsessed, right-wing loon, almost. Wright's own assessment of the Hollis guilt-innocence equation, I thought, was sophisticated and fair. His view was that in cases like this, where there is that level of doubt, that the country, not the individual, should be given the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly see that, absolutely. So, Tim, because Peter Wright himself, well, I guess I should ask, did Peter Wright himself, once he attempted to publish his memoirs, did he become sort of a household name? Like, was this a major story in British news at the time? I know we're fast forwarding a little bit to the 80s now, but I mean, he kind of takes center stage here, was my impression.
Absolutely. We're fast forwarding definitely to the middle of the 80s. Wright retired from MI5 in 1976, and it's worth noting that MI5 stiffed him on his pension.
Oh, that's right.
It had promised to give him a full pension. He had to sacrifice his civil service pension when he joined MI5. But MI5 had said, don't you worry, we'll make it up. They didn't. So they left him in pretty dire straits. And he'd emigrated to Tasmania, where land was cheap, and he set up a horse stud business. And it was pretty much touch and go. I mean, people who went to see him down in Tasmania at that time were shocked by the conditions he and his wife, Lois, were living in. It was a shack. It was, they were living hand to mouth. From that point, from the point he emigrates to Tasmania in 1976, he tried to get his dossier of evidence on Soviet penetration of not just MI5, but of the entire British establishment into the hands of politicians. And he did so because, again, as he testified in secret session in the main Australian trial, and I got hold of the transcripts of those secret sessions, he said, my investigation showed that the British establishment was rotten to the core with Russian agents. 35 eminent persons, said Wright, were listed in MI5's files at the time he left as Soviet spies. And those 35 eminent persons had never been prosecuted. They had never had their collars felt. They had never been confronted. So he had this burning belief, and I'm sorry, I should also say, having managed to dig out of a very reluctant British government many of the files which surround those investigations, the evidence he was adducing is pretty damn convincing. It's there in black and white, and my book cites it and tells you where you can find it should you want to. So he tried to get this dossier of evidence into politicians' hands. No one would deal with it. He particularly tried when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979. Thatcher, in Wright's view, was a kindred soul. She was as right-wing as he was. She loathed communism just as much as he did. And he thought, well, here's the perfect chance. She's going to take this seriously. She refused to. She didn't.
Hmm.
And so this and his penury caused by MI5 stiffing him and his constant attempts to try and get this information not into the public domain, but into the hands of the British government was incredibly frustrating for him. We're cutting out a huge portion of the story, but if we fast forward to 1984, he appeared on television. He gave a lengthy television interview to a British television station for an hour-long documentary in which he laid out the case against Roger Hollis, and he did so remarkably well. That should have provoked at least some reaction from the British government, either to say, what the hell are you doing? You're not allowed to talk, because that was his attitude, or, my God, this is serious. We will now have to take it seriously. It did nothing. It did absolutely nothing. It knew about the broadcast in advance. It did nothing. Within a year, that changed, because Wright decided he was going to write his own book, Spycatcher, and he was going to deal with all of the penetration issues and his career in MI5, with very careful exceptions for some of the most sensitive bits. And as soon as the British government discovered that, they launched into, what can only be described as a tsunami of litigation. Wright was in Tasmania, Australia, and so it applied first of all for injunctions against him to prevent him publishing his memoirs, and against the Australian publisher who was going to publish it. And then it followed those with injunctions in New Zealand, in Hong Kong, in London itself, pretty much everywhere they thought the book was going to be published. And what happened at the same time was that the British government secured injunctions, gagging orders against the British press. British journalists, British newspapers were banned from reporting any of Wright's allegations, and 3 editors were threatened with substantial prison sentences when they tried to. So it became, by 1985 and 1986, a massive cause célèbre. That's here in the UK. Wasn't making much in the way of waves globally until the main trial in Australia. And that is where it went mad. It went absolutely crazy. Because what the British government did in fighting this quixotic battle in Australia was A, ignore the law, but B, twist itself into the most extraordinary pretzel-like shapes. So we're clear. Allegations that Wright had made were accepted as true by the British government in court in Australia, but were simultaneously denounced as lies in Parliament at Westminster. The book was banned, was injuncted, and yet the British government found itself having to publish extracts that had been read out in the European Parliament because it was contractually obliged to print and distribute the records of the European Parliament. And eventually, when an American edition was published, and that was the dam really breaking for the first time, American copies of Spycatcher flooded into Britain. They were sold on the streets outside Parliament. But British MPs were banned from discussing the case. And not merely that, but a former Prime Minister, Edward Heath, was told that he would not legally be safe to read the copy, the American copy that had been sent to him. But if his housekeeper stood by the fire and read it to him, he would be safe.
Oh
All
my
of this
gosh.
was quintessentially absurd. And globally, the British government was absolutely excoriated. I mean, the whole saga was essentially like something out of a Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera or the pages of Alice in Wonderland. It was that absurd. But simultaneously, it was an utterly serious attempt to suppress information which was in the public domain. And in the end, after 5 years of extraordinarily expensive global litigation and 5 years of global condemnation, the British government lost every case.
Hmm.
The book was published for a book which should really only, according to the publishers the managing director I interviewed, he said, we never expected it to sell more than 20,000 copies. In the end, thanks to the British government, thanks to what we can, I guess, now call the Streisand effect, the book Spycatcher sold more than 4 million copies
Oh my
worldwide.
goodness.
And it became a byword for suppression of information and secrecy, absurd official secrecy. It became a global stain on Britain's reputation.
Wow. Wow. 4 million copies. I had no idea it was that high. I would have thought you were going to say 100,000 copies or something like that because it's a bit of a niche topic even then, but clearly not. That's incredible popularity. Do you think that Peter Wright ultimately felt like completely vindicated after all of this was done? I mean, that must have 4 million copies. That's incredible for any author on any subject, no question about it.
I talked to his family, I talked to particularly his daughter about this. And again, the British government, throughout this wretched saga of idiotic, quixotic litigation in courts around the world, the British government launched really inept and really very cynical smears against Wright. And one of those was, well, he's only in it for the money. You know, when I talked to Wright's daughter, she said the money didn't really matter to him. He was a deeply patriotic man. And what really mattered to him, yes, the money helped. They had a bit of a better life in Tasmania afterwards. But what really mattered to him was that the information, the evidence about Soviet penetration and the British establishment's refusal to look at this and deal with this, what really mattered was that this was published and this was out in the open.
I agree. So do you think that the average reader who knew nothing about MI5 up to that point, do they come away from reading Spycatcher fully believing that Roger Hollis was a Soviet mole?
You know, that's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. You know, when I read it, I was one of those who bought a copy in America and brought it back into the UK
Oh, wow.
in 1986. I have to say I wasn't particularly convinced. And it's fair to say that Peter Wright's co-author, Paul Greengrass, who's since become a very famous Hollywood movie director, Paul wasn't entirely convinced either. He didn't necessarily believe that Peter had made his case in Spycatcher. What persuaded me that on the balance of probabilities at the very least there was a case to answer were the files which I obtained on New Year's Eve 2023, which plainly said there was a 1 in 5 chance that Hollis was a Soviet spy.
Incredible. So I'm glad to hear that you came into this somewhat skeptical. That's the perfect attitude to have when you're kind of reviewing a case right from the beginning, as you have. So do you personally, are you in the camp now that Hollis was a Soviet mole, or do you think that 20% is a very solid number?
I'm in the camp and this is going to sound like a hedge, so I apologize. I'm in the camp of being an old school journalist. I work on and rely on primary source documents and primary source evidence. I don't rely on what somebody else has written about it and somebody else has written about what somebody else has written. I go back to original documents. That's what I do. That's what I fight for. That's why I have this continual battle with the British government to try and get things out under the Freedom of Information Act. And with that caveat in mind, what I'd have to say is that the 20% figure is the most reliable, official, albeit fragmentary, version of the story. Beyond that, those files aren't the only files. MI5's files have never been released, and there is no way of forcing MI5 to release them because it's not subject to the Official Secrets Act.
Oh, wow.
It's not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. It's specifically excluded. And there are 32, count them, 32 further government files, Cabinet Office files as they're called, on the Spycatcher Affair, which should have been disclosed by December 2019 at the latest, and which still officially remain closed and secret. I guess I'll be able to take a rather more informed view if, as or when I get to see those 32 files and or MI5's own files. Until that point, I'm going to go with the latest disclosure, suppressed for all those decades, which says there was a 1 in 5 chance that Hollis was a Soviet spy.
Okay. A very, very understandable position, and also just such an incredibly intriguing story. I can see why this would occupy so much of your own time, even so many years later, and for so many other people as well. I mean, it's like I said, it's come up more than once here on the podcast, and we're talking about events from so many decades ago. It's incredible, but truly a very tantalizing story and intriguing. And the fight that Peter went through to get his memoirs published, it really is astonishing to me. Mostly, I have to say, because of so many missteps on the part of the British government, and just a complete miscalculation on what they were actually doing to his reputation by trying to suppress that information so much. But it's out there now, and millions of people have read it, as you said. So that's quite impressive.
And it's worth recalling that everything that the British government set out to do in trying to suppress Peter Wright, silence him, and suppress Spycatcher, it achieved the precise opposite. Yes. Spycatcher was published globally, global blockbuster, 4 million copies. MI5 was finally, as a direct result of the Spycatcher debacle, was finally put on a statutory basis. We finally had a law which says we have a domestic intelligence service called MI5. And beyond that, for the first time, and again, this is a direct result of the fallout from the Spycatcher case, it was placed under some form of democratic parliamentary scrutiny. It wasn't a law was brought in which gave Parliament the right to know, with limits, what Britain's intelligence services were doing and had done, and to review that. Now, all of that was something that Thatcher and her government were fighting to stop. And all of that happened because of this ludicrous battle they had to prevent Peter Wright from publishing Spycatcher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really just amazing repercussions there for the story. And as you know, an amateur historian, there's nothing I love better than this kind of information seeing the light of day. But I can also see how their organizations took an enormous reputational hit by this, but it was certainly a self-inflicted wound there. I hate to say. So hopefully they learn some lessons there, some hard lessons anyway, along the way about not publicizing this sort of thing in the future.
Well, it would be nice to think so. I'm less convinced that that is the case because they are still keeping so much secret. And there is no justification for this. The only explanation I can think of, and please do tell me if anyone else can think of a different one, is that there is something in those files which is even more scandalous.
Oh, man. That's intriguing for sure. Could lead to another book, in fact, if that's the case. So, yeah, certainly makes you wonder what else could be there. Do you have any sort of hints that that might be the case, you think, or is that just the only or one of the possible explanations anyway?
I think it's one of the possible explanations. Again, I talked to people who were involved in the government at the time, and both as civil servants and as politicians. And there's a split. Some say, yeah, there must be something really bad in there because otherwise they wouldn't keep it secret.
Mm-hmm.
And others say, well, the most senior civil servant who came into office after the Spycatcher trials, he said, well, I've reviewed those files. I know what's in them. I can't see where they're being kept secret. So, you pays your money, you takes your choice.
Mm-hmm. Tim, I have to wonder if, coming at this from the other direction, I wonder if are any files in Russian archives somewhere that have still not seen the light of day that might shed a lot of light on this, because I know that they briefly opened up their archives around 1991, 1992, but there really has not been much that came out since then, I don't believe.
There was something which came out in that brief period, which, according to MI5 and its cheerleaders, suggested that Hollis wasn't a spy. It's very hard to assess that. Because the original documents didn't come out, only an assessment of them, and that assessment largely came from people who had a vested interest in supporting the traditional MI5 history. But beyond that, even if we had access to the original documents in the Soviet intelligence files, time after time, what we know of those is that they themselves are not reliable. They weren't reporting necessarily, or always, the facts as facts. They were reporting what they wanted, what they thought their masters in the Kremlin wanted to hear. So, do I think any Soviet do I think that any Soviet intelligence files are the silver bullet? No, I think it's unlikely. I think what would, if they were ever to release them, be put the arguments to rest once and for all, are all the MI5 files, all MI5's files on the FLUENCY Committee investigations, the investigations into Hollis and his deputy and the others, and the Lord Burke Trend report, the one which concluded there was a 1 in 5 chance that Hollis was a spy. If they released that in its entirety, then I think you've got a good chance of getting some form of closure. But they won't.
Right. So unfortunate for us, and it's hard to be patient with this kind of thing after so many years of waiting.
Well, I mean,
certainly
again, if you or your listeners can think of a reason why this material should be secret more than 60 years, or almost 60 years after its creation, long after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in any event, Soviet intelligence knew all of this stuff. So it's not like we'd be revealing something to Moscow that they don't already know. If anyone can think of a good reason, please do tell me, because I'd love to hear it.
Hmm. Yeah, I certainly can't think of one. And I mean, quite frankly, the damage was done from 1951 to 1958. There's not really much more damage you can do. The people that you want to prevent from seeing it knew it before you knew it, really. So it doesn't
Exactly.
really help at all to keep that stuff secret. But the people that are in charge of declassification, I mean, they're not really paying attention. That argument doesn't work on them, unfortunately.
No, sadly not.
Well, I certainly feel your pain on that one, Tim.
Thank you.
Well, as is, even with all the stuff that you've dug up, and you've dug up quite a bit, it's incredibly impressive, and this is a wonderful read and very eye opening read as well. Even though it certainly had me shaking my head in frustration a few times, I really felt a lot of empathy for Peter and his years and years and years of struggling with this question and the consequences of bringing this all to light. So, Tim, now that the book has been published, are you working on something new now? It seems like you've always got something in the works.
Yeah, I'm working on the next 2 books. They're under sale, and I've just obtained the last, what I hope is the last vast tranche of files for both books, which should keep me busy for the next 7 or 8 years, I think.
Oh my goodness! Wow. Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Fascinating.
my books take they take years of research and analysis and cross-reference. But since you asked, the next book, the next book off the production line, with luck, assuming a British publisher picks it up, is a truly shocking story to me. It's again, a secret history, a story which hasn't been revealed before, of how British and then American intelligence knowingly recruited Nazi mass murderers at the end of World War II, recruited them as spies in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and protected these men who had the blood of hundreds of thousands of victims on their hand, protected them from Warkheim's investigations.
Okay, very tantalizing stuff, and I truly do love the early Cold War period, as I'm sure you do as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. But it's still, I mean, it's going to keep you occupied for quite some time, I take it.
That's the next 3 years of my life.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay. Well, I will certainly be looking for that in the future, Tim, and I really appreciate that. Are you ready to talk about the book after that yet, or do you want to keep that one under wraps for now?
I can tell you what the one after that is if you want. It's, again, an investigation, because that's what I do, and it's all based on primary source documentation, into the truth of allegations that the US deployed biological weapons in the Korean War against North Korea and China. And
Oh, wow.
I've obtained an enormous amount of, in some cases, previously secret material. And I should say that in 2009, I filmed extensively, if intensively, inside North Korea.
Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah, and I made a film at that point about the allegations and about the evidence. And since then, I have been quietly assembling a vast amount of additional evidence. So that is book number 2. But frankly, it won't be this decade.
I gosh, well, I'm certain it will be worth the wait in that case. What is the name of that documentary, by the way? I'd like to go and watch that one now.
It's called Dirty Little Secrets. It was broadcast by Al Jazeera English, and I'd stress Al Jazeera English channel, not the Arab channel. It's viewable because Al Jazeera keeps its films online all the time. If you type Dirty Little Secret Al Jazeera into your web browser, up it will pop. It's also viewable on my website.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, actually, if you don't mind sharing that right now, do you have social media pages to share as well, or is the website your primary point of contact?
No, my website, for what it's worth, is www.timtate.co.uk, and you'll find there's my email address on there, because I think it's part of the duty of journalists to answer questions when people raise them. So please do, any of your listeners wants to ask a question or even argue with me, drop me an email. It's on there. Social media, I'm on Twitter, and that is Tim Tate Books, at Tim Tate Books. Sorry, it's not called Twitter these days, is it? It's called X. I do apologize. I apologize to Mr. Musk.
I'm sure he thanks you, but I cannot help but think of it as Twitter, even after seeing X 1,000 times written down everywhere. But it's always going to be Twitter to me.
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Tim. We will link up those links in the show notes of this episode for anyone who wants to follow along or ask Tim any questions. And I'm definitely going to check out that documentary. We've talked about North Korea a couple of times in the past, and just, what an endlessly fascinating country that is across, the past 75 years. So I'm very curious about that documentary now, and I'm really looking forward to your book eventually as well.
You and me both.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Tim. And I hope to have you back on the podcast again sometime soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Take care.
Take care.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.